so now is a good time to ask Martin Mitchell if you want to talk about one fair wage, and then we can vote.
Going on. How you doing, Hub County? So I am here to talk about, as she mentioned, one fair wage. Please excuse me, because I was yelling at the rent stabilization on Friday actually, in Prince George's. So we are trying to make sure that we have a strong permanent bill. Um, and the following day, I was yelling at my kids' wrestling event. Um, but it was all in good fun. As I mentioned, of course, it's Black History Month, and so, one of the things before talking about the bill was just, making sure to mention kind of the history behind, why this bill is important. And so,
What's the bill?
oh, it's called One Fair Wage Act.
Okay.
Yes. And so, yeah, the bill is very simple, One Fair Wage Act. Basically, um, I'll just say one of the first members is our revolution. So, the state one, and I think Jake came to an event, and Ed Fishman, he comes out to a lot of one fair wage events, especially when they were trying to pass a county-wide bill in Annapolis. I mean, not Annapolis, in Montgomery County. But going back to the history, of course, um, we had raised the minimum wage in Maryland January 1, and we accelerated that to $15. Of course, thanks to Governor Wes Moore helping us speed it up a little bit. But there was a lot of people left out when that wage hike happened, and an industry that I'm talking about is tip workers. And so a lot of people don't understand that, like, the legacy of tipping here in America is a legacy of slavery. um, of course, when we were initially introduced to the idea from Europe, it was the idea of tipping on top as a bonus of wages. And in the American way, um, for the tip workers, especially in the restaurant and the food service industry, prior to emancipation, a lot of those workers were males, but thereafter emancipation, a lot of those workers were women, a good majority of which being women of color. And so, you know, it went from the idea of tipping as wages on top to the tipping, your tips are the wage. And so I think it was about 1991 when they came up with like uh, a federal sub minimum tip policy, and that was 213, and it's still 213, federally. And so, you know, when the Fair Standards Act was passed, in 1938, um, a lot of those people were left out. Valets, porters, um, food service, tip industry, your bartender, your server, and a lot of people don't realize, even here, in Maryland, the great state of Maryland, the sub minimum rate for a lot of people is still 363, with the expectation that the tips are supposed to bring you up to the minimum wage. And so, I can say that, for me, my first job was, working in the food service industry. I worked in Laurel at a restaurant that's now closed, it's Applebee's. And several jobs after that, we're in the food service industry. And I think that the food service industry is great. But one of the things that, I've learned firsthand going around the state and talking to, people who work in the industry is that their wages aren't enough. And a lot of them, for one, don't know what they're making hourly. Um, some do know that their base pay is this, but when it comes to calculating your tips based on, what your base pay is, that becomes very difficult, right? And I think that a lot of employers, just speaking to them, a lot of employers will acknowledge that, they should pay their worker a livable minimum wage. And a lot of people know for the time that we're living in, $15 isn't really even, that livable wage as we're speaking of. So, the bare minimum hopefully is 15. And so in Maryland we have a state bill. It's called the One Fair Wage Act. And just to tell you, like, hey, this thing has been done other places. There's several other states where they have raised the sub minimum wage to a full minimum wage with tips on top. Being Alaska, California, Minnesota, Montana, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, and then you have cities like DC and Chicago, and Flagstaff, Arizona, and you have states where it's going to be on the ballot this year. Commonly when you have ballot initiatives, especially one as popular as this, ballot initiatives to win. It's going to be on Ohio's ballot, Massachusetts ballot, Arizona's ballot. And hey, if anybody is a Dem, hopefully that helps. That helps in those Democratic states as well. But one of the things to mention in Maryland is Maryland is, I like to call Maryland a purple. Maryland's a purple state. It's like, it's not a purple. It's not quite blue. It's almost purple. And,
Okay.
it's like a purple state. Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's almost like yes, yes, yes. Well, some people forget that we're the most northern southern state, as well as still just being in the South. And so, the push at the state level is to try to pass a bill. But of course, there's a lot of pushback from, corporations, right? Anytime you try to pass something that's good for the worker, they're going to have corporations, push back because, that's capitalistic nature, right? Like at the end of the day, they see their business and they're like, well, my worker making more, I don't think that's okay. They're okay with making, what they're making. But then, you firsthand talk to these workers and they're like, man, I'm struggling. And then you look at statistics because I tell people, you can just base, you don't always have to base your decisions in like the emotions of other people, but you can look at some of the facts. So when they had the Prince George's hearing, we were looking at the data for tip workers in Prince George's County. And we saw that about 50% of them or more were receiving SNAP benefits. So that went to tell you that like, hey, that something's wrong, right? Like there's still, some type of insecurity where they need to, receive, food stamps, and SNAP benefits, and they're working multiple jobs, right? And one job isn't enough. And so, we really have to ask that question. And then when it really became daunting was when you looked at unemployment during COVID. A lot of these food service workers left the industry. One, because of the conditions, right? Then they had to regulate mask policies. And, one of the things they realized is they weren't eligible for unemployment. So about 2/3 of those tip workers who applied for unemployment, through the state weren't eligible because their wages were too low, and so like that just goes to tell you that like, hey, this is, a major issue. And, not even just speaking from the economic issue, it's also like a women's right issue, right? So about 60% of the Maryland's workforce in like the restaurant tip industry is women, and about like 50% of those are women of color. And a lot of what they experience not only during COVID, but now it's like, sexual harassment, right? And so in states that have passed this, they've seen harassment reported go down by at least half. And the reason I think that could be said is because for one, it helps professionalize the industry, right? Like there's a lot of women and sometimes even guys I talk to, like they'll accept certain behaviors because they're reliant and their livelihood is based on that tip that they're going to receive, right? And so if they were to try to address something or try to respond to a situation, they might not receive that tip that they so heavily rely on. And sometimes it's not just from the patrons. It could also be from the coworkers. It could also be from the leadership. It could also be from management, right? Like where hey, if I don't flirt back with my manager, my shift might get cut, my Friday shifts, and they're putting me on the Tuesday lunch shift where, there's no tips, right? And um, there's even stories you can see now since this issue is being raised where there's some people, and the Baltimore Sun recently had an issue with this, a couple restaurants that are paying people in no base pay. They're paying them in all tips. And so like that's even crazier than the situation that we were talking about. Because that just speaks to like kind of the burnout in the industry of the restaurant. So the restaurant of like, either you're going to work here and you're going to be happy to work as a privilege because it's a privilege, or you're just going to go to another restaurant. You're just going to go to another place. And a lot of times there isn't like an HR that they're complaining to. There's no union, for the restaurant workers. But what there is for the business owners is a restaurant association. The other NRA. It's called the National Restaurant Association. A lot of you not. And Jake, I've sent him videos. They engage in something we call astroturfing. And so if anybody's familiar with astroturfing, it's basically fake grassroots. And so they spend 80 million nationally to go defeat raise the wage bills in other states. And they run under the guise of something called Save Our Tips. And they're what we call the green shirts. And so, you'll see us with the white or the pink shirts, and then you'll see the green with the green shirts. And the reason this is fake grassroots is because uh, a lot of the restaurant association, the managers, the owners, they'll lie to the workers. They'll say like, if a bill like this passes, your tips are going to go away. They're going to cease to exist, or we're going to take away your tips because you're now making minimum wage, or all these crazy things they put in these ideas in the head, or people are going to tip less because they now know you're making $15, right? And when that is false, because a lot of times I turn right to people and I'm like, do you know how much the server is making? You know what I mean? And they'll be like, oh no, I don't know. And I tell them how much, and they're like, whoa, that's incredibly low. You know what I mean? And so just kind of filling their mind with lies. And then one of the things they'll do when they have the hearings is like when we talk about fake grassroots, is they'll give them all the green t-shirts. They'll make them go to mandatory meetings, kind of like union busting meetings. And sometimes what is that the thing with the restaurants called like Serve Pro or Serve Link or something like that? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, so
Training.
so they make you do the training, the mandatory training, and so they're coming in and be like, hey, if you hear bills like this, like, you don't want this. This is terrible. It's going to affect your job. It's going to affect your livelihood. And so they'll tell you things like this beforehand. And so what they do on the hearing dates is they have individuals come from 4 restaurants: Denny's, IHOP, Ruth Chris, and Clyde's, and they all say like, we don't want our tips to go away. Like, we as workers, we're all happy, we're okay. Like anybody like who's not making a living wage, like, we're sorry to hear that, because we're doing well. And so like whether that is the truth or not for those specific workers, that's not the truth in the industry as a whole. Like, and so like I've watched the playbook. They've had a hearing in Montgomery County. They had a hearing in Prince George's. They've now had one at the house this year. They had one last year. So sometimes I see some of the same workers, and I've seen them from the same restaurants. And a lot of these restaurants I've now been able to visit. So I've been able to go to restaurants and bars from Baltimore County to Charles County to Frederick. I plan to go on the Eastern Shore next week and just actually talking to workers, talking to them about the experiences, but then also getting them to become worker leaders themselves. And so some of them have been able to tell their story to the media. Like one of the things that I've seen firsthand is like kind of the lies that the restaurant association has told to the workers. Like the workers will say like, oh, I thought if I made $16, like the bill that passed in DC, that they were going to take my tips away. And, like I really don't, necessarily think I want to take a pay cut because I make as much in tips as, that $16, right? But for the most part, the reason that, that minimum wage doesn't matter to them at all right now because they're making a sub minimum wage for the most part. And their wages are so low, like they'll tell you they receive $40 paychecks, they receive $60 paychecks, or they just receive no paychecks. And they're living just kind of off this like cash dependency, right? And so like for some it could be great, but then for others, they talk about the multiple jobs they have to take. And so one of the things that we try to tell the legislature is like, hey, this is going to be a very big issue during this election. The organization One Fair Wage, they hired a pollster that does the same polls across the nation for Joe Biden, Celinda Lake. And so the number one issue she found was, this to be an economic issue, this to be a kitchen table issue. It's not only 106,000 workers in Maryland that are part of that tipped industry, but restaurants are one of the biggest employers nationwide, right? Like even during the pandemic, we've heard of restaurants struggling, but when you actually look at the numbers, and of course, I've got certain fact sheets, there's actually been several restaurants opening as well, right? And so I can tell you, just in Laurel, pretty much every month there's a new restaurant opening, and the truth of the matter is the restaurant industry has always been volatile. So there's still going to be restaurants closing, but what we've seen restaurants opening at a far faster rate at what they've been closing. And even in states that have passed this, what states that have passed one fair wage, they've seen employment growth go up. They've seen the amount of restaurants in that area go up. And when I first talk to servers, a lot of times they'll tell you that like the elected officials and the people who they believe are the richest sometimes are the worst tippers. It's commonly the best tippers are people who have been servers or who are currently servers, right? Because they understand what it's like to live off of tips. And so what we've seen during the pandemic was if you gave people more money and they had more disposable income, they were able to spend that and they were able to help generate the economy. And so, that's why, of course, for me, it's important to grow the coalition. I went to DSA, Southern Maryland, and so they'll be joining on. But, there's several other organizations, like they have Labor Support Unite Here, AFL-CIO, SEIU, CASA, NAACP, of course, like I'm wearing. But, we definitely need to make sure that, keep expanding the coalition because, like, as the bill continues and, as the effort continues, they will need more connected grassroots. And so that's why I've been working to facilitate that. And, I'm able to answer any questions. And the House bill has 44 co-sponsors. So, they're very happy with it.
Wow.
This is a Maryland state.
Yes, HB 467 is the Adrian Biafo as the bill sponsor, and SB 160 with Senator Ellis and McCray as the sponsor. Yeah, and, I'll make sure. It's Saru Jayaraman, and so she is the co-founder of One Fair Wage. She co-founded the industry or co-founded the organization with Mandu, and they are both like former service workers, and they formerly worked for a coalition called RUP, which is like restaurant workers. And so then after that, they formed this organization, and they've been, helping try to pass bills in other states, other cities.
The nationwide, state by state effort.
Yeah. Yes, yeah, and of course I'll leave a few books as well. But yes, it is a nationwide effort, and it's like we said, it's going to be in the legislature in New York, Illinois, Connecticut, and certainly Maryland. And so you've heard the states that's on the ballot, and so yeah.
How many states currently have a law like this?
You have 7 states, and then of course, like we said, the major cities like Flagstaff, Chicago, DC. But you have 7 states.
And have the hearings for the bills already happened yet, or would there be an opportunity for us to like submit testimony in favor of it if we wanted to, or to be the vote?
No, I believe that the Senate bill happened. I think that the House bill, I think that the House bill, they're gonna they might make an amendment because it sounds like there's interest in, possibly, going to the ballot. And so, we'll kind of see about what the hearing looks like on the House side. But yeah.
In terms of like coalition efforts, like what would you like or expect from like a member, like if we voted to join it, like what would you need from us?
Yeah, so of course, we can give you the petition. We can also make sure to give you, there's a survey if you're ever at a restaurant, feel free to just, ask your server, tell them about the bill. Like, generally speaking, one of the ways that I start the conversation, like sometimes I'll be dining there or I'll just walk up to the restaurant and I'll be like, hey, my name's Martin. I'm with a national organization called One Fair Wage. We're actually trying to help raise the wages for, servers and bartenders. And generally speaking, as soon as they hear you want to raise their wage, they're like, oh, okay. And, they're like, how can I help? So I'm like, hey, so we have a survey. We're trying to, help compile data to tell the legislature, like, hey, this is something important. And so the survey is a great way to be helpful because you can even get them when you're going to, restaurants or establishments. And so some of the questions is like, how much are you making weekly on average? Do you ever experience behaviors or comments that might make you uncomfortable of a sexual nature? Do you
Please
want to be
excuse
involved?
us, we have a
Oh,
grandkid.
you do,
calling.
do your
Oh,
thing.
sorry.
See you later, Liz. Do your thing.
Thank you.
And so that's a great way. And then we have server for an hour events where local legislators, they put on their aprons and they serve like us, the workers, the coalition members at a local establishment. And a lot of times the media loves to cover it. AOC was the first one to do it, and they love to kind of cover it since then. I think like Trone did one, and he came out to the Trone one in Baltimore, and Felicia Porter was there. Um, and so that's ways by coming to events like that and rallies and stuff, and then of course the testimony and showing up when there are bill hearings, and then just letting anybody who might be a server because you never know like who has a story and who might be able to share an experience. So yeah, and then sharing information on social media. So definitely be tapped in on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. One of the things that I say is like, we'll have to continue to beat the misinformation. You know what I mean? And because the misinformation a lot of times is a paid lobby, and they are powerful. But of course, when people come together, I believe that that's more powerful.
Thank you. Do we want to move to join?
Yeah, yes, unless if there's no other comments, questions, concerns, we could, put that on the table, whether we join as an organization, the One Fair Wage Coalition. I think it sounds like a good idea personally, as also a former tip worker, not a server, but delivery driver. I've done that multiple times in my life. And, used to work at Domino's. We got paid the sub-minimum wage while we were on the road. Now, from my understanding, Domino's does pay their drivers the minimum wage. But now that I know that the drivers are making the minimum wage and not sub-minimum wage, it has not affected how I tip at all. I still do tip. And so that's just to say, I believe that's how most people will still continue to tip and work better off with this. And so I'm gonna move that we vote to join the One Fair Wage Coalition. Is there a second?
Yes.
Any discussion?
I mean, obviously, you guys, it doesn't over encumber us in any way. But I mean, we're gonna need
Yes.
help with you.
As you can be. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, all in favor of us joining the One Fair Wage Coalition, say aye.
Hi.
Aye.
All opposed? Looks like the motion carries, so, yes, thank you all, thank you, Martin and the.
Yeah.
One Fair.
I leave some books and agreement for sure. Definitely will.
That's how we can be of assistance